Good morning, good evening, good day, greetings, and might I add, a big helping of salutations and welcome to the Safe Room featuring Security Side Quest. My name is Tristan Watty, and thank you for joining me today for another wonderful experience of the security variety. I take dramatic pauses every once in a while to emphasize that we're about to have some fun and learn about some technical security, I would say specifications. So you might notice I'm solo today. So I think it's going with the Halloween theme, the holiday theme, all those H's. But let me reintroduce myself for those first-time joiners who are joining in to see one person today. Well, my name is Tristan Watty. I come to you from the Professional Services Division of AWS, where we help to accelerate customers' journey to the cloud in a secure manner, fashion, form, and way. Usually, I am joined by Russ Noll from the incident response team, but maybe he has been spirited away. Maybe he'll join me next time. So find out in the next episode of Safe Room featuring Security Side Quest. But for now, all those who are joining me, just like our great producer, Jeff, thank you. And Morgan, thank you for joining in with the live, and a happy Monday to you as well. All right. And hi, Ari. Thank you so much. So we're starting to get some traction, some people. So tell me, where are you dialing in from? Where you're tuning, listening, watching, or maybe there's some signage somewhere in your local area. But if you want more of a detailed contribution to the show, I would ask a specific question. And this question is going to be, of course, themed for this month. Because one, it's cybersecurity. And two, it's also that spooky time of the year. So would you rather experience jump scares consistently, but know they're coming, or rare jump scares that generally surprise you? Feel free to answer in the chat, because this is an interesting one. And greetings from Germany. Thanks for joining me, Anne. So, and Ari from LA as always. So, would you rather experience the jump scares consistently? So that means that if you turn this corner, something's going to pop out at you, but you know it's coming. Or versus you turn 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 corners, and then all of a sudden, kablam! You never knew it. You never saw it coming. And thank you for joining in from Jersey. So feel free to put what your thoughts are. And I think this ties in today's topic very well. So there's a theme we're going with all the episodes this month. And this one is kind of themed around, let's say, the monitoring variety. Last week, we came from, hey, welcome to Cloud Silent Fog, where we spoke about guard duty and its tactics. So now we want to get to a place where, hey, how can we monitor some of these different pieces of the puzzle? How can we think about this? And that's where we think about, hey, we're the safe room. So every safe room needs a typewriter. And if you get this reference, 10 billion points to you if you played this game in the past. But a certain zombie-based game used to use typewriters for saving, right? You got that moment of silence, that piece. The music theme would play on a piano. And then all of a sudden you're like, I can save. I can move on after this. And that's where we wanted to go with today, with thinking about services that might help build that foundation of, I feel safe in my safe room. But how do we do that? What are the foundations of leveraging something like, spoilers, CloudWatch, in order to have security monitoring to give you that little bit of peace? And Ari says, rare jump scares. A lot of horror movies rely too much on them. Yes, some, they just, it's coming. I know it's, the certain music picks up and the tempo, and then somebody drops something, and then all of a sudden, the random person who is not, the horror monster jumps out of the bushes or something, right? And then after that, that's when the monster comes out. I agree with you there. I like the rare jump scares as well, right? You don't know it's coming. You're about to turn a corner, and then whoop, yeah. But if we were to take this into the cloud and trying to think about the foundations, right? Well, how do you establish your safe room? How do you establish your sanctuary within your area, your base of operations within the cloud? Well, you want to provide that same type of feeling. And one of the ways to metaphorically have your typewriter is to document your progress through CloudWatch logs, where you can have your infrastructure collect, preserve, and organize security relevant data across your AWS services. And today we'll cover some of the practical items of that. What I mean by that is the architecture that goes into it. Some of the metrics. How do I set the metrics? How do I figure out the metrics? But even before that, who can view those metrics, right? What are the IAM permissions required in order to do these things? That's an important part of the puzzle. So how do we set that up for success? I think the question really boils down to into our categories of what is my visibility into my environment? So if you establish your safe room, how do you establish your early warning systems and signs and alerts, right? How do I get the sensors that something's happening outside or even inside, because the call is always coming from inside the room, right? So we want to delve into that a little bit and create some type of metric filtering, which CloudWatch has, in order to convert some log patterns into quantifiable metrics. So if you see the same alert trigger one after the other and after the other, you want some type of mechanism to say, hey, there's a brute force, there's a privilege escalation, there's maybe data exfiltration, which is a jump scare in itself when you kind of have that feeling of something's leaving my environment without me knowing. And then how can I set up a workflow to take that alert, that metric, to be triggered into something like a third-party system? Think of the Slack or some type of pager system, right? And then jump into your incident response. So you detected an incident, you reported on that pattern. Now you have to get to a place where something went wrong. Okay, who's responding to it? What is our incident response workflow? How can we leverage something like CloudWatch and its logs in order to help meet investigation timelines, to piece together what happened across different AWS services? And I know what you're asking. You're like, hey, Tristan, aren't there about 5, 6, 7, 8 services that kind of help me with this? I would say yes, 10 points to you. But also, you also want to think about, I say also 3 times for the people on the other side of the interwebs, because there's always additional items and layers that you can add within your security posture. When it comes to CloudWatch, you want to think about all these potential attack patterns, right? What are your unauthorized attempts? What is your credential compromise? How are you tracking these things? What and how do your security operations integrate? So if you have something like GuardDuty, like we spoke about last week, if you have config, if you have even IAM Access Analyzer, how can you build an automated incident response workflow in order to leverage something like maybe event bridge rules and Lambdas with your CloudWatch logs in order to integrate better into maybe a third-party SIM solution? And thank you, Deadlock, for joining. I did my hair today. Maybe that's what you're seeing. So thank you for that. So when we go into and understand the environment, we want to take a step back to think about, hey, how do I detect unusual API calls? How do I make the first move? Do I look in the console? Do I look in my logs? Do I go to my scripts? Where do I go? And this is the question I pose to everyone watching, is when you detect that unusual first call, what is your first move? Is it to check CloudTrail logs? Is it to review a metric pattern? Or maybe it's to trigger some type of IR functionality or isolate affected resources right off the bat? Well, this is what we'll get into. Well, first, we have to take that slow crawl, right? Just like everybody in a horror movie, they're trying to crawl away to get to a safer place. Well, this is the concept that we're using to set up our safe room, so that when we're crawling, running back there, we have something to go back to. So the prescriptive item and methodology approach that we have to take is understanding some of the core concepts with that security focus, that lens. So if I were to run down the services that are the usual suspects. When you think monitor and security related data, if there's nothing else you take away from today, think about guard duty, think about security hub, config, WAF, CloudWatch logs. I say 5, right? Because what you want to do is you want to be able to make critical distinctions between metrics, which are quantitative, measurable, like, let's say, failed authentication methods per minute or per whatever your SLA is, and then logs that detail the event records. So in a security context, think of it like this. If you were to understand your environment, if you have these security items that are generating, you want to figure out, hey, the guard duty, the security hub, the WAF, and config, how are these being processed? How are these being captured? How are these being logged? And the spoilers come within the name of the CloudWatch logs, because what we want to do is create that actionable quantitative metric using something like CloudWatch, right? So, like Ari says, the environment is the final girl trope, right? Yeah, they run, they trip. Yeah, it's a lot of things that the horror movies use. And then, quite honestly, it all comes down to the cost. That is a great point, right? When it comes to understanding your security posture, and this is why I always speak about what is your target state security strategy, because all these factors come into play where you can have, if we take logs, for instance, you can have all your logs saved for the last, however many years, and you can have it dumped into a S3 bucket, or you can have it redundantly sent to your SIM, or you can have it redundantly sent to some other mechanism, right? Like a security lake or a Cribble data lake, or, the list keeps going on and on. But all of that has a cost implication. So what you want to do is you want to see, how can I optimize my environment a little bit? So we'll jump into a little bit of that later. But the key takeaway from that is you want to understand what services you're using and how you can optimize them, right? So leveraging the logs and something like, hey, do I know the difference between metrics and logs in a security context? Do I know how to take something like a CloudWatch agent and deploy it within my environment? Or what is my overall security architecture pattern? Right? These are the questions that you ask yourself, because there may be logs that you collect that you may not need for your investigation. So do you include that? To its point, it's like, hey, it comes down to the cost. So how do I know that I am pretty much ensuring that I'm collecting maybe something like high-risk API calls? Like, think of IAM changes or S3 bucket policy modifications or real-time alerting. All these things play into that bigger piece of the puzzle. Because parts that we start to jump into are understanding those exact functionality pieces. So if we're building out our safe room, we want these foundational pieces. So that way, hey, I don't really need, if we were thinking, let's say 4 walls and there's zombies outside, how do I potentially understand, hey, do I need to put extra boards on this window versus the back wall, right? Because the window has an opening, a gap that I need to fill. So now I would put extra focus there. That's how you start to optimize your environment. But sometimes you have to take the step back, right? Because sometimes when you are all the way zoomed in, you really can't see it. You have to take a look at the overall environment to keep going, right? The next piece of that is, when you're taking that look, are you analyzing IAM, your identity strategy? Right? Because security monitoring is only as effective as, hey, how's your IAM permissions today? I wake up in the morning and ask myself that question. How are my IAM permissions today? Do I have any blind spots? It's a funny question to ask yourself, but when you're thinking about identity, you want to make sure that least privilege, I say it 3 times, not only because it is the spooky season, but because it's something that I want to get across and for it to kind of sink into your head, because this is a major concept. Because if you're monitoring everything, but everybody can see everything, everybody can do anything, you're going to get inundated by different alerting mechanisms. So think about the least privileged access models. Think about cross-account monitoring roles, right? Resource-based policies. All these are pieces of puzzle that you're trying to get into. So as we continue on, I think part of where we want to see and kind of go down, if we were to take a little bit of a spoilers approach, is, all right, where do I start off? And I think the place to start off is kind of understanding what's out there. Because now that we have a path forward of, hey, I want to use this service, now I can start to dig into some samples. So if we were to look into the code sample that we have here, what we start to see is, hey, let us figure out, maybe we want to have some CloudWatch auto alarms that are generated, right? So make it a little bit bigger for everybody. So essentially what this sample coder does is automatically create and configure CloudWatch alarms for EC2 RDS Lambda using tags and custom CloudWatch metrics. All these are important pieces of the puzzle because think of it this way: EC2, CPU utilization, maybe disk space, things like that can trigger. Because if you have something happening within your environment, you want to make sure if that thing is happening, that you get to the place where I understand 100% what is going on, right? So if we were to zoom into this a little bit, we have this approach where we have our different regions. And let me just zoom in right here for a second. So when you think about a CloudWatch alarm that is generated, something happens within your EC2 instance. What we want to do is have some type of alarm or custom metric set up so that if a threshold is hit, it triggers an alert that eventually gets to a place where, hey, something's happening within my environment. So I want to automatically create alerts and alarms to make it, let's say, standard within my environment. Or if something is happening, I wanted to make sure that, hey, if it's using this tagging approach, if it's using this understanding of my environment to break it down to the ones and zeros, I want to make sure that, hey, can I create a CloudWatch alarm to help manage my resources in a way that if from a security perspective, if something happens, it triggers. If it needs to be modified, can I create an automated pattern in order to kind of adjust to the custom alarm standpoint, right? So you can create a bunch of different items with this this sample alone, right? So I say, take a look at this, dive into this. And these are the places where you start, right? Because if you think about some of the default configurations, when you look at a lift and shift kind of approach, usually it's like, okay, we'll just put this into some type of EC2 instance. Main thing that's going to be leverage is, hey, what happens when there's CPU utilization? How are we handling this? Right? And you start to get into the metrics and things of that nature. And this is just a high level, simple use case. But as I always say, you have to take that step back and understand the bigger picture of everything. So with taking that step back, I think part of the equation is getting to a point where, hey, I kind of know what's happening. I kind of feel within my environment that this is some pattern that I'm not recognizing. And these tools are what it is doing what it's supposed to do, is alerting you to that potential pattern. So one of the things that we can do is take the next step of just, hey, I noticed something going on. Let's just dive right into it. So if we pull up our good old Visual Studio, all we did was take a look at and take a dump of the GitHub repo. And now within that, we have the picture that I was trying to pull out. Now we can start to dig into each part of this equation. So there is some YAML, there is some Python within the overall code base. But I think the parts that I want you to focus on and kind of dive into is, hey, if I have maybe a need to have SNS configured within my environment, can I leverage this sample code in a way to understand, okay, if an organization is false, restrict the same account, what is this building out within my environment? How does it play into it? And can I manipulate this code to my own findings, right? There's a couple of pieces. Always, this is the timeout is like, always go through sample code to make sure that it fits your own environment and your use cases, because you know there's a couple of pieces that say, hey, what is this doing, right? So little items that you want to go through. But the reason why I pull this up is just that simple, is you pull down some sample. Now you can start to look at some of the values, right? Because if you are setting up a Lambda function, there's a number of different settings that you can look at. But what you want to do from a security perspective is figure out what is out of the usual for your architecture. And that's where I really take the step back and start to think about it, is like, how do I know what's not important? And you're like, wait, but everything in my environment is important. And that's the key piece to understand, is if you think everything in your environment has the same priority, then think of it from the incident response hat. If I put on my Russ hat, is if something happens within the environment, now how do I get to a point where there's the criticals, the highs, the mediums, the low, right? You want to be able to take logs holistically and be able to boil it down to, hey, my critical logs take this action, whether it be through your SIM solution, whether it be through one of the AWS native tools. Maybe you want to do some ad hoc querying by taking all of your logs, put them into an S3 bucket, maybe using Control Tower, have a centralized logging archiving account, and within that, maybe doing some ad hoc queries using Glue and Athena, right? In order to say, hey, take this snippet in time. We're doing an investigation. We want to add to that flow. Those are all pieces of the puzzle that you need to consider. So as you're starting to work out what's within your environment, what's within your control, you want to continue down this path of understanding. Because the more you know is a key word, and I think that's the word of the day, but also you want to build the foundations of what your security-focused dashboard will look like. We're not looking at just what we were speaking about with, hey, utilization, but maybe that's in there. You want to build out a holistic security strategy, security dashboard, way of thinking, way of life. Because when you start to think about your safe room, your command center, a single pane of glass is usually what the conversation starts out as. But then it evolves from there, right? Because when you start to have the conversations with different stakeholders, usually the first question is exactly what was brought up to us. Oh, this usually boils down to cost, right? We have the live example here. So you as a security professional, right, because you're somewhat of a security professional yourself, is how do you, let's say, justify enabling the guard duty and the VPC flow logs and using WAF and having CloudTrail log to the bucket based on our favorite compliance framework? It's all knowing what the end. I usually go from the flow of, okay, from when an alert is generated all the way to the end of my IR workflow. But if you are a SOC analyst, how do you see detailed threat metrics? How does the compliance officer have something for their audits? This is where figuring out how to build a dashboard is important. Dramatic pause. Right? Because what you want to do is you want to have that identity function in there, because like we were saying, if you have a dashboard, it's a lot easier to give some visibility that is controlled within your environment, that you have permissions and identity roles, all that good stuff baked in, right? Because what you can have is maybe some essential security widgets, some custom metric visualizations, or you can have some maybe real-time monitoring baked in. And this is where you start to figure out the crawl, walk, run pieces of the house. But you want to have essentially meaningful data, meaningful security metrics, right? You walk it back, right? So you have the meaningful dashboard, you have the meaningful metrics. Now you can start to say, hey, we have that early warning system, right? When we think of our safe room. Now we can start to catch security incidents in their early stages, right? So how do we continue on this pattern to analyze the critical aspects? Well, I think that is where we need to look into what has happened before and where we're going. So we have our baseline, we have maybe some machine learning, but how do we pull this together into a cohesive story? I think there's a couple ways I can think of, but the biggest way I can think of is talking about some stories, some legends. And that's kind of where we delve into, as SideQuest Legend has it, where we speak about customer stories in a holistic way of things that we kind of wish we knew ourselves, but in a customer story form, right? So as SideQuest Legend has it, and I think today's SideQuest determines kind of a path forward for, I would say, our adventurers, our people, or just how we move forward. So a round of applause, because we're making sense. Also, what we have to do is kind of start to think about, how do we continue on, right? So we put on our side today and start to go through our understanding. Think about the theme of today and our zombie-based game, right? Where maybe we'll call our customer for today, maybe the Umbrella Cloud Division, right? Maybe they're a pharmaceutical company operating across, a number of, let's say 200 plus AWS accounts, right? And maybe they found themselves in some type of scenario that doesn't look so good, where their annual security audits come and they're trying to get to the part of understanding, hey, how do we handle maybe some AWS sprawl within our infrastructure? How do we understand and support maybe everything from sensitive trial data or patient records or interconnected systems? There's dangers that feel like they lurk around every corner. So I think the step we have to take to understand is maybe we have something like CloudWatch that we can leverage. But our company, our security professionals within this company, they think about the average threat detection takes maybe 3 days, which is not a good amount of time. But this leads to our scenario for today. And this leads to our SideQuest board. So as we get into our SideQuest board within our legend, let us think about it in a certain way. But first, let's make it a little bit of a bigger item to speak about, to think about, because we have our environment here represented within our SideQuest board. And for your first time joining us, that's what this board is meant to do, is visualize our customer story. So as we're explaining, we have our AWS environment, we have our sensitive patient data, we have, as always, our people who are not authenticated. It's just, maybe attackers, maybe unauthenticated users. But to combat that, we have our one authenticated user. So the question is we're right in the vicinity. Usually we start off a little bit on the different sides of the board, but this is a short path. right? And it usually is where, hey, I'm an authenticated user. I just want direct access to the environment. But you know what also happens is it's only a short leap for somebody to maybe have some type of man in the middle or some type of exfiltration. So the outside users are also, right, maybe having the same short path as you as an authenticated user. So this brings into the first question that I posed to chat is, hey, what keeps your security operations team up at night? Is it maybe shadow IT resources, unmonitored databases, legacy systems, or maybe compliance blind spots? All these are pieces of the puzzle that we're trying to figure out, that we're trying to go down. And in our use case, in our challenge, we found out, hey, some of the requirements from our customer story today is they have maybe cross-facility evidence collection. Maybe they have some monitoring or automated quarantine systems that they need to put into place. Maybe they have protocols to prevent certain things from leaking that can be sensitive in nature, including PHI and maybe some proprietary information because this is a pharmaceutical company. So what we're trying to figure out is how we contain said structures. Well, I think part of the spoilers that we spoke about is maybe having some mechanism like, okay, we have CloudWatch. I mean, CloudTrail there, right? But you're expecting CloudWatch. Got my words mixed up. But the same notion applies. It's like, hey, we have CloudTrail. We're capturing the logs. We're fine. Well, are we? Because I figure we need other mechanisms in play. We need something like CloudWatch itself, right? Because if my resources are generating certain items, hey, I want some metric alarms to kind of pick up, right? So this is part of our holistic strategy. Because if we are trying to do an investigation, if we're trying to figure out what's wrong, we want as much logs, as much visibility as possible to start building out a view into our environment. Because again, we are confined to these squares, but it's usually that shorter hop as we were speaking about. So continue on with this notion. We can go through and have a number of different services, right, surrounding. We can have our firewall with our WAF. We can have maybe guard duty pick up on some suspicious activity. Maybe it's the administrator themselves trying to get in that guard duty is picking up on, right, before it gets into the environment. But if we are having these reoccurring items, right, how do we have the advanced warning system that maybe it's somebody else? Guard duty can trigger, right? That can be part of our detection deployment. We can have some cross account monitoring architecture. And this is where I give the quick reference to the SRA. But part of this is trying to drive what is our monitoring system within real time, and then what is aggregated throughout our environment in terms of log collection, in terms of understanding, in terms of next steps. Because usually the next steps after something like this is, okay, what happened, right? And if we don't understand what happens, we start to hear a different type of music playing. It's a little bit slower and sadder. This is not the safe room music. This is something else about to occur. And that's usually when we need to hit the pause game button, or as I call the Zach Morris timeout, and kind of take that step back and kind of figure out, okay, I'm looking at my board. And right now, one of the things that I'm trying to identify is what's happening within my environment. Part of incident response is trying to figure out when something occurs, how do we kind of look at our environment in such a way that we can be better prepared for next time. So let's think about that a little bit. So if we have incident response and our investigation patterns, and we're trying to get some real-time threat detection configured, I think part of the strategy is, how do I create rules based on my current environment and potential things that have happened or I am trying to prevent from happening? Because you can have specific attack patterns like brute force authentication. Perfect, right? You have multiple failed login attempts, right, from the same source. Or privilege escalation. All these are pieces of the puzzle that you're trying to figure out. So using something like maybe pattern matching syntax within CloudWatch logs insights, or just metric filters. There's a simple metric filter that you could put into place that says, hey, if you see this happen more than twice, more than once, if it's root account, you want it to happen pretty much all the time. But you want to have an alert generated. You want to have some type of mechanism in place, especially when it comes to accessing resources, so that you can have your role creation strategy, correlated to your alerting strategy. Interesting concept, right? Because when you're starting to create the rules, what you're doing is essentially you're creating a workflow of alerting and then eventually automated remediation. So by the time something gets triggered within your environment, you can say, hey, it already was resolved. Now I just have to investigate what happened again. I have to dig a little bit deeper. I have to dive a little deep and to figure out, hey, how do I optimize this going first? Right? How do I optimize this going second? How do I optimize this going third? So on and so forth. And if I were to use maybe an investigation query with log insights, how do I optimize my queries so that the essential items, when I'm searching for millions and billions of log events, right? How do I write an efficient query in order to do this, to go through, to understand, right? Especially if it's within 24 hours, because think of our use case, our customer story. I know we use the fictitious umbrella cloud company, but part of the puzzle is starting to think about really all these different items, right? Because if we have 200 plus accounts in our fictitious example, think about all of the alerts that can be generated. Now, how do I optimize my querying strategy in order to do this more efficiently? Because you need to, if a security incident happens, you have kind of a timeline of events. And you want to build out said timeline in an efficient manner. And part of that timeline is, how do we search through this? Right? We can go through a couple of different techniques. There's detective and so on and so forth, but we're focused on CloudWatch for today, and the logs and the insights, and kind of figuring out a way to chronologically order to see, hey, how did an attack progress from its initial access through laterally my environment? Then ultimately, what were they trying to do when they did that? Were they trying to exfiltrate data? Were they just trying to do system compromise? Were they trying to bring down some, servers just because of some reason, right? Think about is, hey, we're about to launch a new product. Well, there might be some bad actors that say, hey, I want to put kind of a halt on your product, where that can cost the company an exorbitant amount of money to recover from, because that was their launch of their product. And that's why when we're thinking about building out our safe room, right? And I know I waited a little bit if you see what I did there, but what you want to do is you want to make sure that you're capturing all these different pieces of the puzzle. Do you have your typewriter? And you might say, hey, a typewriter is old-fashioned. But in the context, if we were to take this analogy a step further, what you do with a typewriter is you are more prescriptive, you're more thoughtful on what you're typing, because every key you have to be kind of a little bit more careful. And that's how I want you to think about your overall monitoring strategy. You want to be careful of how you're thinking of it, how you're setting it up, because you don't want to be inundated by different alerts, which we often see, where it's just like, hey, we have alerts set up for everything. And when you have alerts set up for everything and there's no priorities, then you don't really see anything, right? Because your responders might have, that alert fatigue. So leveraging the correct mechanism within your monitoring strategy is another piece of the puzzle that you just kind of have to go through, right? But the question pops up, and I asked to chat, how do you organize your CloudWatch logs? Do you have regular checkpoints? Like think of a typewriter and save points. Do you have an item box / central repository? Do you have some cross-region magical storage going on? Or do you have maybe a third-party storage? We'll call that our merchant shop if we are continuing on the theme. Or do you have your underground facility like every good horror movie, right? Where your long-term archive is stored. Yeah, that's a key piece of the puzzle. But I think the way we see customers kind of answer and ask these questions is based on what are we integrated with? And that's where the different SIM platforms come into place, right? And think about external security tools. You have your AWS native tools, and then you may have some external partner tools that you all have to work in harmony to ensure that you have the correct mechanisms in place. So I'm looking at the Splunk, and then the Datadogs, the Sumo Logic, all those things, right? So there's a couple of different ways to get logs into those systems. What I've seen customers do is maybe have a CloudWatch log subscription filter with a Kinesis data fire hose that has high volume streaming to that Splunk or Datadog or Sumo Logic, right? So they're able to get some information over there. But this is where it's important to note is, okay, we'll just send everything to the SIM platform. But you know what happens is if you don't have rules set up at either end to do some ETL of all that data versus maybe some rules set up in those systems, you just get excessive things. And then you might have criticals in there, but do you view every critical the same? And that's an organizational, that's an environmental kind of item and question to ask, right? So getting to that point is an important way to think about, hey, how are our APIs integrated? How is our data transformed? How is our authentication set up? What is our bandwidth optimization techniques? All these things go into play when you kind of are integrating all these different items. Because if we were to stick to the native flows of using something like maybe EventBridge, right, to build out an automated incident response posture, hey, now I can detect and respond. And that's the eventual goal of a lot of organizations, to get to the point where, hey, I can automatically respond to this threat. And I don't know about everyone on the other side of the internet, but I would like some auto remediation playbooks. And how do you build out these playbooks? Well, when you have your CloudWatch alarms, your log patterns, you have maybe security hub findings, and you're able to build the rule set in order to take all of these, including guard duty if you were watching last episode, in order to maybe create a ticket, update the ticket saying this action was taken, this happened. Maybe you have the auto remediation of, or I should say auto isolation as well for further triage and investigation, right? All these are pieces of the puzzle that you want to get to, that you want to understand. But I know what the feeling is that exact thing of understanding. And what we want to do is we want to reduce that feeling you get where you kind of hear, the music. I don't know what to do, right? It's that feeling when the music is going faster, right? Picture any game, it has that sound. But how do I get to a point where it doesn't bother me, where I can quiet it a little bit? How can I get to a point where, hey, I am that person? Well, of course, there's the little things and little paths that you can take, like, hey, certificate knowledge, taking some of the AWS certs. right? But sometimes you need to go on other quests of maybe the knowledge variety, right? With knowledge quests. So when we speak about a knowledge quest, what we're essentially getting to is a part or a function where, hey, I'm that person. I've built the aura of security understanding that people like to kind of gravitate towards, right? Because maybe it's just like that glow that this person knows what they're doing. I feel safe that they know where the gaps are, that they're monitoring through their CloudWatch logs and their dashboards and things of that nature. Meanwhile, you're taking that step back to say, hey, I might be just a level 100 person. And in the context of this show, maybe I'm just a research assistant, right? Let's say we're a research assistant in the horror movie, right? Where do I start as the research assistant? I think it's a fair place and a fair question to ask. So I think the first piece is getting to a point where, hey, do we have the dashboards? How can I do research to see what's happening, right? And looking at CloudWatch, it gives you that visibility to say, hey, can I look at the alarms per service? Yeah, I think that's a fair place to start. Because I'm just the L100 going through and understanding, okay, on the dashboard it says X. Okay, now I can take the step further as this research person in order to say, okay, what are metric alerts in CloudWatch? What are the concepts I need to understand when it comes to this? And this is kind of how you dig in a little bit further and build up an understanding of the metrics and the namespaces and all these kind of things. Because you're trying to get to that point of, hey, I kind of understand all these different concepts, all the verbiage. I understand the service. Now you can start to dig a little bit deeper and become that field researcher where I'm actually starting to dig in and analyze the logs. Right? It's the fun part is you get the bright new shiny badge, and I went from research assistant to field researcher. I'm digging right in. And I'm understanding, hey, with CloudWatch Log Insights, what are the different kind of queries that I can issue against the data sets I have? Because in our customer story today, we went over that it could be millions of pieces of data. Now we're starting to get to a part that we say, I just want to query something. And there's some generative AI that you can leverage within the CloudWatch Cloud Console. But I think parts of understanding just to start off with is, hey, what are some of the visibility items? And what are some of these important notes that, you don't really understand if you're just starting out? If you're understanding the foundations, how do you take this to the next level? I think that's an important piece of the puzzle to get to, right? So let's think about this for a second. If we take that step back, I am a security professional that's trying to understand. I just went from researcher to a field researcher. Now, how do I understand what is going on when it comes to, okay, what are these metrics doing, right? Okay, I can query them. I can query the data sets, but how do I use the power of something like, how do I say this, math, in order to better understand what is happening within my environment? Because this is one of the things that you could do is you start to manipulate things when you're in the field researcher spot, right? Because when you have different events that you want to occur that maybe you just don't want something like CPU utilization to be the only thing that alerts on. Maybe it's CPU and RAM. If those two items go up for no reason, then trigger an alert. So understanding the M1 plus M2 logic, right, is a big thing when you're in the field, because now you can start to build some complex items that eventually lead to certain remediation steps. Because from a security lens, if you start to get to a point where you say, hey, I am that person that is trying to figure out what is happening within my environment, I can start to take remediation steps ahead of time. The early warnings that we were speaking about, I can design around this concept, right? And I don't know about everybody else, but I feel a bit more confident if I was in maybe a zombie outbreak of having my little safe room with the bells and stuff like that in the forest. That's what we're getting to, right? Is having those bells in the forest to know, hey, I heard something, right? And speaking of jump scares, if you hear something with those bells, you want to be prepared. So what we want to do is delve into this a little bit more and getting to a place where, hey, how do I design and implement? That's a big place. It may not seem like it when you're first starting out, but this is how you get to be a chief researcher. Is now you're starting to come up with the designs, because you started out looking at the dashboards that were created. You worked your way backwards to a point where, hey, I know where these metrics are coming from in the dashboards, and now I start to understand the math that I can do to make and create custom items. Now I'm starting to come up with my own design based on understanding my environment. So it's a key place to be. So take a look at that right there, right? Designing and implementing. Key parts of the puzzle. So understanding the different items and services, integration points, key parts of the puzzle, right? So eventually, when you level up yourself, you start to get to that part. And then things like maybe what we were speaking about earlier of, hey, how do I get to an automated flow, right? Using tagging. When I have certain resources tagged a certain way, I want items to happen in a specific format and methodology, because these are the foundations of what a playbook is created off of, whether it be from the automated or the manual standpoint. Because what I have seen with customers is when they get to the part of creating a playbook, maybe it's manual, they have mechanisms built into maybe their SIM of, hey, this alert was generated. Now we can execute this playbook, right? Maybe it's the EC2 instance compromise. Well, that we have a playbook for this. So it makes you have that feeling that we were speaking about in the beginning. Is it makes you feel a little bit safer to go about. And as always, it's dangerous to go alone. So you have to take something with you. And why not have that be a monitoring strategy that is derived from your target state security strategy? A lot of strategies, a lot of things to come up with. And some of the ending parts that I start to also mention is delving into the next steps. And usually those next steps involve what we were just speaking about, right? If we bring it back up is, hey, prescriptive guidance, way to be, right? But let's go to planning, right? So if you're using CloudWatch, this is an important consideration. Are you doing a centralized or distributed approach? It's a question that's not really asked until it's like, hey, just get it up and running. But this is part of the foundations, because determining what services you are going to use plays a much bigger part than a lot of people may think about, because there are different services that you can leverage. There's different methodologies, different approaches. And when you think about centralized and decentralized, your approach for each could vary, right? Where you remediate, how you have logs. And then also, shout out to all the compliance people, is when you have compliance ramifications, that also adds into it, because maybe you're not able to centralize because maybe there's a data set that contains sensitive data, and maybe you have data within the United States, and then maybe you have data in another country, right? And different rules start to come into effect, right, from a compliance standpoint. So if you're sending logs, what exactly you're sending, right? It's an interesting question to pose, but it often is something that after the design of, hey, we'll just centralize all the logs. Okay, where's everything based? Well, it's based in the US. And where is the central company? Oh, maybe it's based in another country. Maybe it's in Canada. Maybe it's in the UK. Maybe it's right. All these things start to come into play. And then you have to think about the compliance ramifications. And maybe if you're using something like Control Tower, now you have different logging archives, maybe one local to the States, and then maybe one in the other country. And that's where you have to start thinking about and kind of map these different items out. So when you dig into this and understand that distributed versus non-distributed approach comes in to play a big part of the puzzle. And if I were to figure out, hey, where do I kind of start off with? I usually go one to the security section, but CloudWatch has some, examples. Use the examples. And let me zoom in and say, use the examples because they're there for a reason. They're there to help you along your route. So when you think of deleting alarms, detecting anomalies, things of that nature, right? All these different pieces of the puzzle are pieces that you can say, hey, we have implemented it. These are the foundational items that you build within your playbooks, right? So as we continue to move on and have these examples, I always find it interesting when it says, learn the basics. Yes, learn the basics of this because it's in every different form and fashion for a reason. So as you continue to move on, you start to get to a place where you say, okay, I have some bases for CloudWatch, right? So I think another interesting place where it's often overlooked is, let's go quickly to the Bodo 3 documentation, right? It's like, okay, CloudWatch, and it gives you the information for it. But use the examples, CloudWatch, creating alarms in CloudWatch, getting metrics from CloudWatch. This is some good pieces of documentation to help you go through, where if you're just starting out, trying to build out your safe room with your monitoring, hey, this is the scenario. Alarm that triggers over a certain period of time. Okay, that sounds like a great starting point. And it gives you some ideas on how to get started and some code to get started, right? From a Bodo perspective. And all these are pieces of the puzzle that you can start to add together to understand what your overall target state security strategy should include. I also give the shout out to the SRA, Security Reference Architecture, because that's a big part of the puzzle, and also Control Tower, things of that nature. But I think the biggest part of the puzzle that you have to take into consideration is building out your incident response plan, as I channel the inner Russ, because that's a big part of your puzzle, your equation, right? When you solve for X, X is the incident response plan. But X also can stand for XP, which is experience. And you always want to make sure that with every item that you read, you absorb, that you start to think about the XP that you built out, because every experience point helps you to level up not just yourself, but the security posture and those around you. So with that note, on today, we leave with this note of use your typewriter in your safe room and tell us about it and come back next time. All those good things. So until next time, have a good one. Take care. Have fun.